Let's step back a little, take a look inside our true self, get comfortable in the uncomfortable, and let's embrace our reality. Life is tough, but so are you. Welcome to the Choose Your Attitude podcast with Nicholas Strand. Join Nick, author of Loving Someone Who's Dying, as he shares his experiences of life loss to life on the road as a traveling roadie. He and his guests will get into real topics while encouraging you to let go of the past, lift up the present, and fiercely build your better tomorrow. Let's get through this together. Now, here's your host, Nick Strand.
Hey, welcome to the Choose Your Attitude podcast, where we discuss real life stuff, learn to master the only aspects we can control in life, and use it as a tool to make today the best day of your life. Every morning we wake up with a choice to make. What attitude are you going to create your life with today? We chat with people of all walks of life, people sharing their own stories and tips of some of life's most difficult journey. There is no proper way to do this correctly, besides talking about it and walking through the process, no matter how difficult it may be. So let's train the elephant in the room together, but first, a word from our sponsors. Are you looking for some much needed motivation? Maybe a new way to feel inspired? We know that life is tough, but so are you. Finding that perfect shirt you've been dreaming of is a tough journey, but we have you covered. That's why we are here with Choose Your Attitude Apparel. Wear it with confidence and remind yourself you're choosing a way to success. It is a constant reminder that you can share with others. Join the Choose Your Attitude community and share an attitude of style that others will want to be a part of. So get yours now at chooseyouratitude.com. Would you like to be a sponsor on the Choose Your Attitude podcast? Reach out to us at podcast@chooseyouratitude.com. Okay, welcome to Choose Your Attitude podcast. Excited here. Streaming at podcast.chooseyouratitude.com. This episode is also, I've got it set for video as well, that you can find and subscribe to others at youtube.chooseyouratitude.com. And I want to welcome everybody. I'm excited to have Ben Valdez, a friend of mine, who I actually met through Washington State FFA. He was an officer in 2008 to 2009. And I actually had Brianna, we were together, and she was actually helping me with his team, putting that team together. He is now a counselor, a substance use disorder professional. Fancy. So I wanted to ask you kind of, do you remember kind of like some of your quick explanations or descriptions of remembering Brianna or anything like that?
I do. The one thing I remember about Brianna specifically is her laugh. She was always laughing, and she was just like super fun and easy to talk to. I felt, and actually I remember her, and I think it was Brooke. They came to Wenatchee, and I was a chapter officer during that year. And I remember meeting them on that level as well. And so just instantly liked her. She was an awesome, awesome lady.
Could you notice when you saw her any of the fact that she kind of had this hidden disease, or at the time you had no idea?
No, I had no clue. No clue whatsoever. I think she may have mentioned it, but the way that it was mentioned was just like so nonchalant about it, where it wasn't even like a focus.
That's how she usually operated. Yeah. So the book I wrote was about her and about grief, and I wanted to talk to you about that. And kind of walking into Corona, there's kind of some things that have kind of popped up. And as we've kind of processed through this, I've saw a lot of on the social media in January and February, as this stuff started to kind of hit, you kind of saw a lot of anger, you kind of saw a lot of craziness. And it got to a point where a lot of people were just like, positive, got to be positive. Why is all this negative? And kind of working through it, I noticed some kind of relations with grief.
What's really interesting about grief and loss is it doesn't necessarily have to apply to like the loss of a loved one. It can be like the loss of a lifestyle. It can be the loss of opportunity or the loss of a relationship. And I agree with you in the fact that like it's really interesting to see how people are responding to this pandemic right now, because it is a loss of certain types of freedom that a lot of people have been taking for granted. And in that respect, like I could see that as being very applicable to the grief and loss process regarding the loss of a loved one. Is all of a sudden that person's gone, and we're facing similar situations.
So kind of like in this whole entire aspect, we have all these freedoms and we're so used to being able to kind of share our freedoms. And all of a sudden, all these freedoms are removed, helpless, unnecessarily able to control anything, but almost in the same, but backwards of somebody who might have cancer, or somebody like Brianna who had cystic fibrosis and there was no control.
Right.
So now we're kind of put in a spot where all those feelings are removed and those powers are removed. And we almost become helpless.
In a way, what I find really interesting too is like, and in particular with Brianna, and just in how this works with what she had and her diagnosis, is that in the stages of grief, the end stage is acceptance. And so with her, I see her as being able to accept where she was at from the get-go. And it put her in a position to actually have some sort of peace given the circumstances that she was in. And I think that like a lot of the times what people are facing right now is that they haven't fully accepted the reality of the situation. And then, and that without accepting the reality of the situation, of course, you're going to feel miserable because it's attempting to try and control things that are out of your control.
So Kubler-Ross, is that how you pronounce it? Kubler?
I think so. I can't. Ross.
Yes,
with
Ross.
the K before Ross.
His grief cycle actually kind of follows exactly how we felt as this thing kind of progressed. It starts with denial, goes into anger, goes into bargaining, then depression and acceptance. And I feel like that's exactly how we've progressed. At first there was the denial. Some people argued it. Some people had the science. Some people, kind of went both ways. And then there's the anger where you had all these arguments, people in denial, but people who knew. And then there was this kind of friction. And then the bargaining comes into effect. Once you lose that freedom and you go inside, some people are like, well, the science says we need to stay inside. Those that are trying to still in that denial phase saying, well, if I can go outside for this, and then the depression side is kind of where we're all kind of slowly accepting the fact that we have to now remove all these freedoms and become uncomfortable and actually not bow down, but kind of accept the fact that this monster is kind of not winning, but is in control.
Right.
And then the slowly part of acceptance where we all kind of push it off to the side a little bit and no longer want to hear it because it's kind of that battle now in between depression and acceptance.
And what's really interesting just about the grief and loss process is people can jump and shift between stages at like the drop of a hat. It really depends on, like, sometimes people can be in full acceptance and then all of a sudden go immediately back to a denial, depending on the situation and circumstance. And I think that a lot of people are in many different forms of the grief and loss process. And so it's interesting to me just from like looking at it at like a psychological aspect and sociological aspect, is that it really does start to highlight certain deficiencies in human character. Because if we're looking at and relying on external events to make us feel internally happy, all of a sudden, right now, as a prime example, we're deprived of a lot of external stimuli that can actually make us feel a certain way. And so, like, I've been personally taking this as an opportunity for like self-exploration and like looking internally to being like, okay, like, how much am I relying on, very trivial and very superficial things to feel some type of a way? And getting to that point where internally you are happy with where you're at and who you are, and then it doesn't matter what happens externally. It doesn't matter what happens around you. Is that because internally you're fine? And with my patients, I deal with that a lot. Is they struggle a lot with the grief and loss process, and with whether it be loss of family members to death or some other illness, but they also lose a relationship with their substance. And so they experience this type of disconnect and this fight to try and make something work when it just doesn't work that way.
I feel like I've seen a lot of this too in kind of the emotional standpoint of social media. I've noticed with social media and texting in our world today, a lot of what we've learned today or kind of where we're at is with social media and texting, almost all our communication now is through text, through words. And so unlike a phone call or a FaceTime or even an in-person situation, I feel like all of a sudden we've all become brave to be able to say words that we necessarily wouldn't say if we were in person, because all of a sudden we would become responsible for that emotion that we then cause on those people. And I feel like right now we're kind of learning that exact thing, is all of a sudden those emotions have become real because we no longer can run away from them.
Right.
And that is kind of in the same thing of grief. So like, for example, with losing Brianna, of being able to embrace the reality that it's not a bad thing she's gone, but her passing in that grief, and being able to kind of keep that on the surface to kind of acknowledge that and not be afraid of it, which is difficult, but kind of in the same sense of what's happening now. Some of us hide it, and that's kind of that denials part of pushing it away. And part of getting past grief, would you agree, is kind of keeping that out on the surface and being able to try to get to that acceptance part, but continually making sure that that's where you reside in your grief.
No, absolutely. An essential part of the grief and loss process is to not suppress emotional pain, but to truly experience every emotion that you experience. A lot of the internal conflicts that people have are denying emotions or believing that you should feel a certain way when you don't feel that way in that moment. And the truth of the matter is that the grief and loss process, it is very easy to identify specific stages after the fact. But when you're in that state and going through those emotions, it's a roller coaster. It's all over the place. It's not uncommon for people to feel really happy one minute and then extremely depressed the next. But it's normal to go through that roller coaster. It doesn't feel normal in the moment because those are emotions that we don't like. But truth of the matter is, like, that's the process, and everybody's process is completely different, and everybody's process is also equally okay. And so it doesn't really matter how people process it, as long as they are processing it, and instead of avoiding it. And the way it looks to each individual is completely different.
So being able to accept that everybody processes it differently, and that way they process it is okay. But what's important about this is to be able to accept that state. And would you also say that even the state of hiding it is okay, or is it important to constantly kind of analyze yourself and work towards that uncomfortable stage to be able to make that then comfortable?
I think it is extremely important for people to be uncomfortable. And I don't necessarily mean that strictly in the grief and loss process. I just mean that in general. You know, being uncomfortable is a painful emotion. We don't like feeling it because we like the comfort zone. There's a reason why it's called a comfort zone. But when we're uncomfortable, it sends signals to our body that something's not right. So we need to change in order to try and make that more comfortable. And so when we experience those feelings of discomfort, like that's growing opportunities. Those are opportunities to like reflect on things and say, I need to change in some way. And then you do. And then that's how people continue to grow and continue to move forward. And in relation to the grief and loss process, staying stuck in a stage, especially the earlier stages of denial, anger, depression. Depression is one of the later stages, but that one's just not a good place to stay. But when you're stuck in a stage, that's when I believe that's where people get a majority of their problems with not being able to process and deal with the grief and loss. It's because it comes down to avoidance of the actual pain surrounding the issue, avoidance of the anger, avoidance of the depression, and then it leads out into like really, really strange ways.
So I would kind of almost relate some of that to kind of these inner battles. So what we've kind of just summarized is accepting everybody kind of does it differently. And what's important is not so much being offended at the way they do it, but help everybody through it.
Exactly.
In their own manner. And either A, helping yourself understand, or by learning how other people are interacting through it to help yourself through it. And kind of that interaction. And I think one thing too that kind of like connects this is you see a lot of these people right now. And when I say these people, I feel like that was kind of offensive. I didn't mean it in that sense. But what I'm seeing is a lot of people posting solid fact of the reality that we live in. And the response is, why aren't we posting things that are happy? And I would say that they are happy and they're positive because they're reality. And I think that there's a connection there as well, is that things that are positive aren't so necessarily always happy, but yet they're more of the embracing that reality aspect. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the times, some of the best things for us to hear doesn't feel good when we hear it. But a lot of the times, that's how we learn and that's how we move forward, is we have to, all feedback that we get, and feedback in general, I'm saying that very loosely, not just feedback in terms of like a conversation between two people, but feedback on the media about what's happening with COVID, like all this kind of stuff that's happening. All of that is positive because it's giving us information and increasing awareness. And increasing awareness about certain types of things, that's always positive. And whether or not we actually follow through with the information that's given to us, that's on each one of us. But the feedback that we do get, yeah, it is positive. It's giving us some type of direction, as well as some type of just any type of direction to look into and or evaluate. And so, yeah, I agree with that statement. I do think it is positive.
So right now we're kind of consolidated into our fine space. There's levels of too much stimuli into that subject, but at the same time, it's important to continue on the subject and not bury it. I know that normally our lives get super, super busy. So when it's something, for example, when Brianna passed and dealing with those type of things, our constant live in motion helps sometimes hide those things. And it makes it more difficult for us to approach them or acknowledge them or find the time intentionally or unintentionally to address these subjects. but I feel like right now is one of those opportunities for us as families, friends, and close people to the people around us that are important, to maybe start talking about these things, and acknowledging those, and processing through them, as a group, and not only for the cohesiveness of community, but at the same time for yourself.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. It is super important for all of us in this time to truly like look at areas in our lives that are that we have been suppressing, or that we've been relying on all these other things to fill some void. And truth of the matter is, I mean, life's going to continue whether we want it to or not. And the way we respond to it is going to impact our experience. And so personally, I choose to experience my life in a positive light, but that doesn't necessarily mean that being positive is avoidant. You know, being positive just in general is a very healthy place to be, but it doesn't mean that people are avoiding the pain and avoiding the reality of the situation. It's just how you respond to it is the key. And it is important for everybody to process every emotion that they get. We live in a society right now where there's this false perception that every single one of us has to have it together 100% of the time. And that's unrealistic. That's not even possible for anybody to do. And then to have that expectation on ourselves, but also on other people, that's not fair to anybody. And so, you know, getting to that point where we, as a society, can truly admit our faults, but then continue to process those painful emotions that we're told to avoid, or that we're told that we shouldn't experience. When we can get to that point, like, we're going to see an advance. Like, it's going to be, and I'm not talking, you know, in terms of economic advance. I'm not saying that, but I mean, personally, I think that each person would advance and actually become a lot happier internally with where they're at. You know,
I found the other day, kind of looking where I kind of caught on to the grief part of what was happening. When this all started, a lot of people I've talked to has talked about having a hard time to kind of find themselves because they're in this feeling of uncomfortable that they've never felt before. And when it dawned on me about the grief, to kind of get over that, what I had realized is that I understand I'm writing my book about Brianna, and also my mom who passed. And so these feelings have really been out for me, and something that I constantly am aware of and I constantly are walking through. But what I realized is that feeling all of a sudden piled up with what's happening now. And so what was actually resisting me was actually the pain from that stuff, as opposed to all this stuff. And so by saying that, I'm connecting to what you're saying as well, is that not only is this time good to acknowledge and address the uncomfortable of where we are, but also address the pieces in our past that maybe are still buried deep, and finding that special someone or ourself and trying to acknowledge them and kind of bring them to the surface.
Yeah, 100%. If you're thinking of just, I mean, since Brianna and I were both in FFA, so like if you pull out a weed, like you don't just take the top of the weed off, like you have to pull it out at the root. And that's how you get rid of the problem. And the same thing works in any type of painful emotion that we have. We tend to get hyper-focused on all of these isolated incidents and isolated events as like, okay, though, this is the reason why I'm responding this way. And more often than not, that's just the straw that broke the camel's back. Like, there's a lot of other stuff that we don't necessarily address the way that we should. And it comes out in really weird ways. And it comes out at like very random times where some people will respond in a certain way and it doesn't fit the situation. And we're like, why are you responding that to this? Because that's not really the case. And more often than not, that's not the reason why they're responding about that way. That's the focus of why they're responding, but that's not the true cause of it. And yeah, like you said, it relates to a lot of stuff underneath the surface that we have to like start addressing when it's now brought up again.
So for example, like the anger, that's kind of one of those stages of, that's popping out when it's you're not expecting it to in other situations besides the actual underlying cause. And so this is kind of one of those areas where it's just bringing up some of the other triggers that you're noticing. In addition to this, I feel like that's a lot to kind of take on. And I know that, take it in numbers or in stride, but because we've relieved ourselves or we've removed ourselves from our normal busy life, I feel like it gives us a good time to really focus with a family member or even like a classroom. Take baby steps. So maybe spend like 15 minutes to 30 minutes a day with your close one and kind of start communicating with this to kind of build forward. Would you agree with kind of the current? And I could even see this go as far as planning some of the future of the scary topics of like death and will that I know that Brianna and I discussed. And I'm not saying we're going to die. I'm just saying, because we're at a point right now where we're able to slow our lives down, we're able to kind of focus and relax through some of these pieces to get a better feeling of that uncomfortable, as opposed to when we're busy, it's a lot more difficult to feel that way.
Yeah. Well, and I think that with the busyness, we have so much readily at our disposal to satisfy whatever need we need satisfied in the moment. We have the ability to, leave and go here, go there, go to the store, go to a movie. We have all these different distractions. And then now that those distractions are no longer evident, we start seeing a lot of people having these responses. And it's interesting to me because a lot of people are experiencing these deep bouts with depression and this isolation and this loneliness and boredom, and all of this is creeping up. And truth of the matter is, like you had mentioned before with the grief, is you've always felt that way. You've just avoided it and you haven't addressed it and found other ways in order to manage it. There's so many other ways that we can manage a specific emotion effectively, but we just find one thing that works, and then we just rely on that to be successful from here on out. And then when that tool is no longer available, we have nothing. And then people get stuck in this chaos and with these emotions, and then they don't know how to handle it. And then it comes out in really weird ways and really toxic ways to some.
So I could almost on my last recording I had, I compared it kind of to football, to where if you've never played football and you want to go play, you're uncomfortable. And so it's kind of scary to start. But once you've played a little bit, you have a little bit more confidence.
Right.
And then at the same time, it's the same way of you're uncomfortable. Putting yourself in an uncomfortable situation makes you help build yourself to be better at acknowledging those pieces. So when and if these things that life happens like this, tragedies, trauma, we're able to then be less in the panic or less in the struggle and more in the understanding to be able to make it through a little bit more comfortably.
Right. We become a lot more resilient to life. We become a lot more capable to handle life on life's terms. Life on life's terms is something that's very common in the addicted population. And for myself personally, I strive to consistently be in some form of uncomfortability. being comfortable at all times for me is dangerous. That to me leads to complacency and then boredom, and then I'm doing really weird things. And so it's one of those things to be in this constant state of being uncomfortable, because it's a constant state of growth. And you're right. I think that the more that people address the things that are uncomfortable and continue to be uncomfortable, when something else happens to them, they're able to bounce back a lot quicker. And change happens all the time. Change is something that every single one of us has to deal with. The only problem with change is people that resist it. If you resist change, it becomes extremely uncomfortable. But if you embrace change, it's a lot easier to handle. And so right now, in the way that the state of things is in this country, but also the world, is it's a drastic change, and it's a tragic change. But it's also something that if we're going to continue to resist it and fight it, it's going to make it worse. And emotionally, physically, all of it. And so accepting the situation allows us to move on. And in grief and loss, that's truly what it is getting to true acceptance. And then you're able to look back on the experience, and doesn't mean you won't feel sad, but it means that you can actually look at it differently and then appreciate it for what it was, and then use it as a foundation for where you're at now.
Almost a better understanding of your reality that you stand in. Absolutely. Yeah. As opposed to being confused. So in change, or like you said, with the change, I think one of the things too, that kind of, is an issue, or I don't want to call it an issue, but a struggle people have is the feeling of control. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. Mm-hmm. Is not only is it a big change in the reality of what it is, but it's in having the ability to control when those feelings come out. So for example, in a normal life, we're able to do those things of the movie theater or stuff to control our feelings. But now all of a sudden we're forced into a situation we're uncomfortable with, and we no longer have control. So almost some of it too is accepting or realizing the world we stand in is something that's a lot more than what our current feeling is, and trying to understand that and become more comfortable and familiar with that. Mm-hmm.
A lot of what we do as a society is attempt to control things that are not in our control. And when we focus on these things that are not in our control and we spend energy into trying to control these things, it increases stress responses. It increases anger, resentment, all these kinds of things. And realistically, the only thing that anybody has control over is themselves. You have zero control over anything that's outside of you. And so when we're looking at the way that we're feeling in certain situations, I firmly believe that the way we feel is a direct reflection of what we're doing and how we're thinking. And if we're doing something negative and we're thinking something negative, we're going to feel something negative. That's just natural. But if we're doing things differently, thinking differently, we'll likely have a different feeling. And I say it all the time with my patients. I'll ask them, if you're feeling this right now, what are you thinking about? What are you doing? And it's like, if they're saying I'm feeling depressed, it's like, well, I'm thinking that my life sucks. And what are you doing? I'm laying in a dark room. Of course you feel depressed. Of course you feel sad. You're doing all these things and thinking these things that's supporting that emotion. And it's important to understand the distinction too between situationally appropriate feelings versus a continuous feeling of depression or anxiety, whatever it is. In this state right now, in the way that the world is, it is situationally appropriate for people to feel fear, to feel anxiety, to feel sadness, to feel boredom. That's normal. But it doesn't have to be a regular thing, and it doesn't have to continue unless you legitimately choose for it to continue. But we legitimately have that power to change our thought process and do things differently.
But I would also have to put in there too that that's the project. The overall project is to try to stay positive, but it's still healthy and good, like you were saying, to have those communications and be able to make sure that even the people listening, just because they're saying something negative, that's part of the process of them understanding their situation, so that way they can actually steer themselves into that positive atmosphere.
Absolutely.
And I see a lot of this in myself. I know with Brianna and the control aspect, my whole entire life, those 10 years that we were together as she was passing away, one of my biggest stresses was that simple thing, control. And that control was, I had no control of her health. We had no control of how fast it was going to go or whatever. And so there was times that I would try to fix that. And now I've learned that control is something that we don't have control over. And there's a bit of acceptance, but at the same time, you're one of my friends, close friends that has dealt with me, but is also after all this and feeling those feelings, is trying to talk through those feelings, so that way you can learn the present triggers. So when you feel that, you're able to overcome. So for example, I myself had that moment when I had 5 days after this whole shutdown happened where I just could not get on my feet. But then once I found that this was a lot of what I was feeling was grief oriented, all of a sudden the next morning I completely swapped over, because I was realizing, oh, that grief of Brianna, that grief of my mom being gone, I then had the ability to acknowledge that and go, oh, here's that piece, to be able to work through it, as opposed to being confused. But it took talking through it and figuring that out. So I guess one of those things that we would come at right now is, what are some things that you would suggest that we can do as a family or friends to open up these discussions? Because I do know, like, especially death, I've said it before, and sex, drugs, stuff we learn in school, death we don't. And that's one of those areas right now that I think we're touching, as well as we all are going to die. We're human. We're all going to die. And this has reminded us of that. And I think one of the things that this is a good time for as well, that I think I've already stated, is in addition to talking with your spouse or whatever, to be able to help have better communication for your feelings, it's also maybe a good time as you go through those feelings to discuss those topics that are difficult. So when and if that trauma occurs, we're able to actually get through it a little bit better. And once again, it's not something that we have to do all in one day. Baby steps, just maybe something like, how do you feel today about this situation? And this is good to do with kids as well. It's a big topic. We understand that, but it's good to discuss it.
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's super important for people to be honest, truly, with whatever emotion they are experiencing. And I think we put up this front, like we have to have our stuff together all the time. So when people ask us how we're doing, more often than not, people say, I'm fine. It's okay to say you're not fine in that moment. It's okay to say you're struggling. And just vocalizing that actually reduces the pressure, and it actually gets people aware to keep you accountable. And so, here's why I feel depressed. Here's why I'm sad in this moment, or here's why I'm struggling with this particular thing about this particular loss. opening that kind of dialogue is extremely important. Being able to honor truly what we are saying. So when people ask us how we're doing, I find myself doing it too, saying I'm fine when I'm not fine. And I'm making a conscious effort to say, like, I'm tired, I'm annoyed, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm happy, whatever it is. But yeah, I do think that the families in particular, and especially the younger, the better, raising generations to come have that mindset to be able to vocalize truly what they're feeling. Working in my field, it's so much of trying to figure out truly what a person's feeling, because they're rarely honest with what they're truly feeling. And it's like, I don't want to treat and or help a symptom of the root cause of the problem, which is the true emotion you're suppressing and whatever that is. And so, yeah, I do. I think it's extremely important for people to have that conversation and talk about the reality of death and the reality of grief and loss. We tend to operate under a fantasy land of that everything's going to be great and we're going to live the American dream and we're going to have the job and the kids, whatever it is. We all have this perception, and it's taught to us at a very young age, and it's not accurate. It can be for some people, but for a majority of us, it's not. It doesn't go the way that we planned, and it's that portion where we get this fantasy life that we're not able to achieve, and then we go. How we respond to that is completely different. And it could be very damaging if we don't have any other skills. But like what you were saying about being able to talk it out, work through it, to be able to recognize the trigger, I think that's extremely important to highlight, to be able to recognize, like, when I'm feeling a certain way, that's a trigger from the grief I've experienced. And so I remember this from the time that I worked on it this other time, and that coping skill worked for me in this situation. Let me try it now. And or if that doesn't work now, so what else can I do? What other things can I do in order to help me through this and get through it? And in grief and loss in general, the important thing, again, is to honor the emotion you experience. People experience it completely different. Some people laugh, some people cry, some people get really angry, hit stuff, whatever it is. And the way we express the emotion is specific to each individual, but it needs to happen. And it needs to be okayed for that to happen, not told that, no, you can't suppress that, or you have to suppress that because right now, no, you can't do that.
When I lost Brianna and my mom, both of those exact things happened with family. If you look at some of the things that occurred, you could definitely put them as very mean or hurtful. Mm-hmm. But like you said, the better understanding to understand that they weren't intentional. They were just the reaction of those people feeling uncomfortable in their processes of grief. And so those are where some of those angers occurred, or sometimes things that they weren't really able to think clearly because they were stuck in that kind of environment. But understanding those situations and sometimes reflecting back on that helps us move forward. And one of the things, as you were saying that too, is we're constantly adjusting. So what you talked about yesterday is going to adjust today. But the whole key of this is being able to continue talking about these subjects and not being afraid to communicate them. Is key. I know that's one thing that I'm struggling right now with people and meeting people, is exactly like you said, is usually they will come up and ask me how I'm doing. And that's usually a unintentional learned culture that we've all been trained on. And that's usually for them. They're not actually wanting to know. They may want to know, but they don't, that answer they may not be prepared for. And I've noticed on my own, I've had to be careful on what I say, because the way they act or the way they receive that. And so that's one of those things of, like you said, though, is I've tried both of those, but it's most important, like you said, to be honest of that. But what I found is kind of like that whole positive, happy thing with social media, or people just, I want all the positives. Well, the happy, but it's more of the embracing of the reality, and I find that whenever I share with somebody new that I've met that these people have passed, and it's a burden. I don't want to call it a burden because that's the wrong way to use it, but it's a challenge that I'm learning that isn't anybody's fault. It's just a culture that we're having to deal with because we're all in different stages. I've lost a few people, so I have a little bit more comfortability of that, where some people don't. And so what I guess when we say that whole discussion with other people is getting you comfortable in those areas that we're all human and we're all going to have these uncomfortable stages of death and grief. And so that helps us as a community get through those things. And I think that's even right now going back to social media and how we've removed emotion because of text, because of social media. And I think it's even more important right now to address that so that way we can bring those emotions back and help us move forward. Because I feel like that we've kind of, this is kind of a grow up session for all of us, to realize how much emotion we've removed and how much community or the lack of control we have, in that reality. And I think this is kind of one of those stages where, I mean, it's, if anything you can do to kind of like wake us up to realize some of these things, this is it. Because we've really taken, that orange peel and really peeled those pieces off. And that's why all of us are just going crazy right now. And some of that control too is we don't know how long this is going to be. And that's a whole nother thing too, is that's a whole nother level of control. Well, when, what, focus on now, and let's talk about now. Yeah.
No, I completely agree. And I think that what's, in my opinion, with everything that's happening right now, I think that a lot of the denial surrounding the losses that people are experiencing is based out of fear. And it's, which fear comes out in really weird ways, just like anger does. And the fear of what's going to happen in the future and all of these other things. And we get so hyper focused on being stuck in quarantine for however long it's going to be. And truth of the matter is none of us know how long it's going to be ultimately, because this changes daily, almost hourly it changes. And so when we can get to that point where right now, what am I doing? How am I feeling? What am I thinking about? And am I good? Am I not good? If I'm not good, what do I need to do? And if I am good, what's working? And so having those inner dialogues is really important, because in this time, we can still learn really valuable coping skills with many different things. And I firmly believe that this is a huge opportunity for people. But with your choose your attitude, I have a very similar mindset, and I've adopted that a lot for quite some time. And it's taken a lot of practice, but truly it is an opportunity, to look at these things and being able to have that conversation. And when we actually start addressing these painful emotions, it becomes easier to address them when they keep coming up in the future. It becomes easier to work through them and to process them quicker. It's a skill, and any new skill, it takes practice. And the more you practice the behavior, the easier it becomes and the more ingrained it becomes. So that way, when you do experience a painful emotion in the future, instead of suppressing it, you're comfortable with talking about it. and then you talk about it, you work through it, and then you move on. And so this avoidance of all of these emotions, it's delaying the inevitable for things like this. And when we all of a sudden don't have the opportunity to continue avoiding, and now we have no skills to cope with it.
I think I think another point that I'm realizing as you said that too is because we are human and because we are constantly adjusting, is there's never a solution. Rather, there's the understanding. So as we better understand, we're able to adjust to these situations, and they bring everything to the table. So some things that I've learned is sometimes certain snacks that I crave will put me into, I understand I'm in certain situations when those are, or specific meds kind of put me into an emotional roller coaster.
I think in terms of in grief and loss in general, I think that we as a society want to make the person who's grieving feel better and or be okay. And that is the worst thing that somebody could do. It's very rarely that we want to make the other person feel comfortable. What it is we are uncomfortable because they're showing raw emotion. So I want them to stop so that way I feel better. And that's the worst thing you can do to anybody that's grieving. You're stunting that process. You're telling them stop doing that because I'm uncomfortable. We don't necessarily think that consciously. It just becomes this ingrained behavior. It's like we see people crying, we give them tissue because we want them to stop crying. We've manipulated it to be a comfort, but truly it is a comfort for us, not necessarily for them. And I get furious actually when I'm doing group sessions and people pass tissues to other people that are crying. I'm like, no, they need to experience that emotion. They need to feel that pain. It makes it real. And it can be very damaging to the person.
Or even the person handing the tissue over, him himself is going through that experience. And that's why it's important to communicate and create this, because not only the person giving and sharing the information, also the receiver of the information is learning something and learning about themselves as well.
No, absolutely. And it's really damaging to tell the other person that I know how you feel. And I believe I've told you that before. And don't say that, because you don't know how somebody feels. Like, I don't know how you felt when you lost Brianna. I don't know how you felt when you lost your mom. I've lost people in my life, but that's nothing compared to the loss that you've experienced, because I did not feel that pain. There's no way I could have, because that's specific to you. And so anybody that's going through that process, we don't know how they're feeling. And honestly, some of the best things you can do for anybody that's grieving is to just physically be present and then help with whatever they need in that moment. And if you say, I'm here if you need me, you better be there if they need you. You know, it's not a false promise in that state.
I think that's huge right there too, is I would almost take that to a whole nother level as well, of not only be there when they need you, but one of the things I struggle with is almost everybody in the same kind of scenario of being comfortable is everybody goes, let me know if you need some help. Well, it's also kind of reciprocated in the fact of it's important to actually reach out and remind them, hey, I'm here right now, as opposed to come get me when you need to, because most of the time that's the uncomfortableness of I'm too uncomfortable to say, to keep entering that.
Right. And there's subtle ways that you can do that. You know, you don't necessarily have to have the same conversation, but just, hey, how you doing? Or what'd you do today? Just starting a dialogue, because in the grief and loss process, people feel very alone. and very isolated and in pain. And so just knowing that there is an avenue and or someone else that they can reach out to if needed, and regular reminders that that person's there is important. Absolutely. And not forcing the conversation to talk about something if the person is not ready to talk about that conversation. They will bring it up when they're ready. And if they do, and you open the door and say that you will be there, then that's on you to be there. And so when that door is open and you're the one that opened it, you have to be prepared for following through with your end of the bargain. And in that respect, it opens up that dialogue with that individual to where now we can talk about this. We can actually communicate that I trust this person enough to be able to communicate about this painful emotion. And then that relationship continues to grow. And I don't mean relationship in an intimate form, but just relationship between a family member or a friend or a
community member. Yeah.
Yeah. It can be anybody. And so it continues to be, it puts a relationship in a different level that a lot of people don't have with a lot of different people. And it's one thing to be able to share a happy experience with another human being and have that happy relationship. But when you can actually process pain with people that you care about and then continue to work through it, that's truly when you meet people that will significantly impact your life. The people that will stay with you through the worst, the good, all of it, because they've proven that they will. And so it's important to understand that we have all these different emotions and we experience all of them. None of us are, except for obviously maybe a sociopath. You know that?
Yeah.
It's one of those things. But I mean, it's true though. Like we have to be able to have those conversations and move in that direction.
So it's one of those things of having these communication pieces to work through everybody from the receiver to the giver. But also at the same time, since a lot of us like to be the parent or like to, like you said, fix things, but more so being there as a listener and an acknowledger of when somebody shares their feeling, of being able to say, yes, that feeling is real. But then at the same time, that reciprocation sometimes from that person is sometimes an attempt to make sure that they are okay or that feeling is normal. And so by accepting it allows them to feel comfortable. But then when you try to father or parent, what happens is it makes them, and this is all unintentionally, this is all kind of the culture aspect, but it makes them feel like that feeling is not accurate when our feelings are accurate. And so by acknowledging it and helping people through it and listening, even if you don't understand, and if you don't understand as the listener, it's good to talk through it and ask questions so you as a listener can learn how to be a better listener and asking those questions to better feel and understand.
No, absolutely. And I think it's important to note too that if we become, you made a really good point with the person reaching out to try and parent the other individual, because also what that does is that sends a signal to the other person that this person can solve my problems, because when this happened, the grief went away. And so what happens then in the future when that person can't solve the problems, now I'm resentful or now I'm angry towards that individual. And it's very important to help people ask questions. How's it going? What's working? What's not working? What can I do? What do you need? Is there anything? And if nothing, okay, that's fine.
So you bring up a good point there too of we then become dependent on that person for a feeling unintentionally because they are trying to fix things. You walk away feeling better. And so you're actually not making yourself better. You're just by that connection with the other person. And so by being able to have these communications now, mind you, like you said, is finding people that challenge you, but then at the same time understand or acknowledge you, it is good. And that's not, I think it's good to kind of decipher that of these people that listen. And if you find somebody that helps you through that, that's not a bad thing. But where it gets bad is, for example, when people help you not acknowledge this stuff, or for example, if there's a friend that you know will never ask you or doesn't want to talk about the bad things, or and you go to the movies all the time to take you away from that, they're not going to be able to dig deep. And so they sometimes take away from that.
What it does is it puts a Band-Aid over an infection. And you don't fix an infection by putting a Band-Aid. Like, you fix an infection by scraping out the wound so it can heal properly. And yeah, there will be a scar, but at the same time, it doesn't hurt anymore. And it's not as painful. You can look at it and remember the pain, but you don't feel that pain. And so that's a very common thing that happens, is being able to just put on this quick fix for a long-term problem instead of actually addressing the actual problem and dealing with it then, so that way you can move forward and then move in a different direction. And then when other events like, something like this happens, God forbid that happens again, but just in something where just as devastating, even on an individual level, you can remember from the learned mistakes that you made and or the learned helplessness that you had before, and then just move on quicker, be able to handle it and bounce back quick.
I think one thing that comes to mind with this as well is that everything in our past, no matter if we feel it's fixed or not, is always going to be present. So much like the word heal always makes me laugh, especially with death and my mom and stuff like that. I get a lot of people that tell me, you need to go heal. You need, well, you don't heal. It never goes away. It's always there. And so getting it to a point that it heals, but you become comfortable. So when it does start to bleed again, or it does become present again, you're able to acknowledge that and find that and be able to address it productively.
Right. To where it's not just a brand new, fresh wound anymore. And I think that's what a lot of people experience when they suppress grief is it's still very raw because they don't work through it. And then years down the road, something happens and then it brings up all these emotions and it's just extreme. And it shouldn't be that extreme when we're working through stuff properly and or we're able to respond better to those emotions. It's normal to feel pain. It's a signal to our body to tell us that something is wrong. And that's why we have to address it. And if we don't experience pain or continue to avoid it, it leads us to make really terrible decisions or harm ourselves even more. And not just physically, but emotional pain. And in my opinion, emotional pain is so much harder than any type of physical pain that we can handle. It's easy for us to identify what part of our body is hurting. But when it's an emotion and we're not addressing it appropriately, it can stay hurting for a really long time.
I think one practice, as we're talking about this, I keep going through of things to be able to address these different things. I think what's helpful on some of these discussions to be able to get to maybe subjects that are difficult to talk about, that are actually between you and somebody else, as opposed to subjects that are about you. Some of the good practices would be like, for example, talking to that person about what would happen if trauma was to occur. Talk to that person. And when I say if trauma was to occur, as a plan, and then the same thing for like a death or a will, those type of things. And as you talk about those things, you become more comfortable. So then all of a sudden you're able to start acknowledging those feelings with the person you're talking with, and able to start getting deeper, because now you've reached a subject on level playing ground, that to be able to work deeper into the emotion.
Absolutely.
I think that wraps it up. We got some pretty deep stuff here. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate all of it.
I think we did cover a lot of really important things. And I think it's just very important to honor the emotion you're experiencing. Don't avoid it. It's normal to experience whatever emotion it is. And being able to identify that that is the emotion. Okay, what can we do to work through it? And when I say work through it, I mean work through it effectively, not through ineffective choices, but processing the key, not drowning it in substances, and not drowning it in sex or whatever it is. It's literally being able to handle and process the emotion successfully. And then you learn that skill, and then it becomes ingrained. And then in the future, you can become unstoppable when it comes to those kinds of things. There will be no limit.
You can create your life by choosing your attitude.
That is correct.
Thank you for listening. To reach out to Nick and the Choose Your Attitude community, find us on social media at Choose Attitude Create Life. Share your attitude with the world with merch guaranteed to encourage at ChooseYourAttitude.com. Be sure to share us with friends, family, and colleagues. And while you're at it, leave us an uplifting review. We'd very much appreciate it. Check back for new episodes. Until next time, choose your attitude, create your life.